We talk about wisdom. One of the wisdom books being the book of Ecclesiastes. The author makes one of the ultimate goals to be able to clarify what our limits are as part of wisdom, because it's so great to learn so many things, and it's so wise to learn a new thing each day, but it's also wise to be able to acknowledge the things that we don't know, to realize just how much that we do not know, and then thus being able to, at that moment in time, in that mentality, to be able to place your dependence upon God and make God the center of your lives. And Jesus teaches us how to do that with the simplest form of prayer that he ever established, and that was what you heard in last week's gospel. You may recall the original form of the Our Father broken down into five petitions meaning five good things to do in the Lord's name. The first petition being, that is, hallowed be thy name. That is to acknowledge that God is above all, that God is all wisdom, and that God is vindicated. And then the second petition there of being who art in heaven. And so, hallowed be thy name. That means that we are called to realize God's kingdom on this heavenly earth, to do good things and not to get stuck on the things that make us unhappy. And the author of Paul's reading in the Colossians kind of identifies those vices that I'll talk about in just a second. And the third one, remember, give us our daily bread, to take things one day at a time. You heard in the gospel 2 weeks ago what happened to Martha. She ran around like a chicken with her head cut off, right? And then what happened to Mary? Well, Martha was complaining and whining about her, saying, she's just sitting there listening to you, Jesus. Well, hello. She's doing the right thing at that very moment. She's taking the time to breathe because she needs to take a breather. She needs to recuperate. And she realizes it's time to take a time out, listen to the Lord, so that she can have a fresh start. And Martha is caught up in the chaos and blindness. And Mary is setting a fine example by just sitting there and listening to Jesus, so that she can start over and that Martha can learn from that experience. And then we look at that fourth petition of to forgive us our trespasses, especially when our neighbor that we may have offended us at one time, especially when they're asking for pardon, that they, that God is the source of all forgiveness and that God forgives. And that if our neighbor is pleading for forgiveness, then we should especially do so, especially when, let's say Diane just cut over Lorraine's yard by 5 inches and she raised holy heck about it and went sick and let Diane know about it 6 months later. Well, hello, Lorraine. So Diane keeps saying, I'm sorry. That's about time to ask for that pardon that God, that Jesus teaches us in that fourth petition of the Our Father. And then our final petition of not subjecting us to the final test, but later being translated as not to lead us into temptation. And that is to ask the Lord's help to steer us away from temptation, steer us away from the things that counter the Lord's Prayer. First and foremost, what we find in our first reading from the book of Ecclesiastes, when the author starts off by mentioning the vanity of vanities. Vanity, translated in the English, literally means vapor or to vape or to breathe. And it's mentioned 35 times in that book. And the author is lamenting about some of the trials and errors that he had done, and realizing that the true meaning of wisdom is to be able to clarify our limits, acknowledge our limits, and invite ourselves to place God in the center of our lives so we do not run into the vices that counter the Lord's Prayer. As we heard the five petitions of the Lord's Prayer, Paul, in our second reading from Colossians, identifies the five vices that counter that. First one being immortality, then we heard impurity, then we heard passion, then we heard evil desires, and finally we heard the word greed, which is idolatry. And greed is clearly defined and used in his example as the layout of our parable in our gospel when Jesus talks about the man who's stuck with all of his possessions. He says, what do I do? I have so much stuff, I better just tear down my barn so I can have a place to store everything, right? And then so he's going to tear it down and have a larger storage space for all of his possessions. And Jesus' message right there is saying not to get too focused and too caught up and too blindsided by all that, because that is going to be temporary. And that same message can apply to when we are encountering difficult moments in our lives, whether it be with a family member or a friend who has had a fallout with us, or somebody that we work with in the workplace that's complaining about something that we are doing, running into a Martha somewhere that's complaining about what we're doing, knowing that that's also just temporary. That too shall pass. But the Lord's love and kindness and compassion is always with us. It is indeed the center of our lives. And as we celebrate this 18th Sunday in Ordinary Time, as the kids are getting ready to go back to school so soon, I invite them now to come forward and remind them that they are invited to place God in the center of their lives as they encounter the challenges of each day, of learning, of making new friends, of meeting new teachers. So please come forward as we'll have our blessing of our backpacks.